Dr. James Kelly, thank you so much for joining me here today.
Thank you for the invitation. Delighted to be here.
I've been really looking forward to it. I've got your book here, The Catholic Reformation, a very short introduction. It's part of that wonderful series that Oxford does, these very short introductions. I really recommend them to people. I wanted to start with this like a claim that just jumped off the page for me when I was reading your book. And it comes from the very beginning. You say, the Protestant Reformation and its legacy is without a doubt a pivotal moment in history. But in terms of moments that went global and affected the most people, the Catholic Reformation is arguably the event in the early modern period, playing at least as significant a role in shaping the world today. I found this fascinating because as I reflect on just, how I was taught history, it's, you've got like Roman antiquity, you've got the Dark Ages with all the problems of calling it that, right? But then you have the Reformation and the Renaissance. And I didn't, hear a whole lot about the Catholic Reformation. And if I did, it was by a different name, which we'll talk about in a bit. But let's just situate this idea here. What makes the Catholic Reformation so important? And maybe why have we not noticed that?
Yeah. Okay. So, well, I would recognise it was provocative saying that, and deliberately so. So I'm glad it grabbed you. Um, why do I think it was so important, and why have we not talked about it as much? I think why it's so important is because it is global, and I'm sure that's something we're going to talk about more. But because of that global nature of it, it's almost got lost into different national stories. And sometimes because of that, and it's so difficult to bring it together, it's been slightly neglected. And as you've alluded to, it goes under different names because of what's going on. So where you can talk about the Protestant Reformation, and is a seismic moment, so it changes everything. The Catholic Reformation happens at different times, in different ways, in different places. And to try and bring that together, and I do recognise that happens with Protestant reform as well, but it's difficult. Whilst we can have a nice catch-all with Protestant Reformation, we can all think of what goes on with Luther. Admittedly, we often forget, of course, about Calvin, which is the odd thing about it, but we all think about Luther and we've got this idea. Catholic reform, we don't really have this idea that's kind of inherent in it. I would say as well, it's probably something that both of us are in the English-speaking world. And so by that very nature, the Protestant Reformation looms larger than the Catholic Reformation. Whereas if you're in, say, Spanish-speaking, French-speaking, Italian-speaking, I suspect you would be far more aware of it, but in a different way.
That's helpful. And one of the difficulties, and I think you were alluding to this a little bit, is kind of pinning down what it is we're talking about when we talk about the Catholic Reformation. And likewise, as you said, it's tricky with the Protestant Reformation, or at least in the scholarly world. I think there's been a lot of effort to say the narrative of just like 95 theses and a singular movement. A lot of people like to talk about reformations, which seems to be just like in vogue across the academy and everything. We just add the plural to things that were previously singular. But with the Catholic Reformation, what are we talking about? What kind of time period, and like how? I guess when we have something really broad, we still need something that like bounds it as a coherent whole in some way. So what are we talking about?
Okay, well, the first thing I want to say is actually I think you're spot on with this idea that currently there is a vogue for saying the Reformations, and I think it's been good for recognising Protestant reform looks different, and there's different arguments, there's disagreements about what Protestant reform looks like. I think what I would say before we even talk about the time frame is that we tend to forget that happens on the Catholic side as well. We tend to think of it binary, Protestant, Catholic, and we think of the Catholic sort of world as this big monolithic stomping beast, one size fits all coming along. But instead, recovering that there's debates going on and it looks very different. So I think that's a key point. I'm sure it's one that's going to come out as we talk even more. But when we're talking about time periods and what it looks like, if you like, old-fashioned way of looking at it was to link it direct to the Council of Trent. So we would be talking from about 1545 to 1563 and the immediate aftermath. So very much locating it there. Now, there are problems with that, you've alluded to, with the name, because it happens in different places over that time. So if you're thinking of an era of Catholic reform, a good idea and a really loose idea, and there's lots of disagreement about it, is to think of it from around the same time as what will become Protestant reform is coming to the fore. So end of the 15th, start of the 16th century, but then through to the French Revolution. So very much a sort of early modern period. That Catholic reform predates the Council of Trent, and it certainly goes on after. Most of what we would think of as Catholic reform in some ways comes after the Council of Trent.
That's helpful. And this kind of old school, just linking it to the Council of Trent versus broadening it a bit, has to do, in my mind, with this question of the sources of this. And in the Protestant world, and kind of like Lutheran studies, it seems that Luther studies, there's this question of like, was this just the inevitable unfolding of history and Luther just happened to be the guy that was there at the time? Or is he this really unique kind of person who, without him, there is no Protestant Reformation? If I'm tracking some of the directions that your book is taking, it seems like there's a similar question of, is Trent and the Catholic Reformation just this reactionary thing that happened, in this unique moment? Or is it part of this long history that, gradually unfolded and maybe reached some type of flashpoint in the 16th century, but was by no means just like not there and then there in a day? And I think that's going to link to the naming that we're using here of the Catholic Reformation versus the Counter Reformation. So maybe we should address that as well, because people might have been wondering why we're using this terminology.
Yep, and again, it's very deliberate use of that terminology, because as you're alluding to there, when it has been mentioned, it's often referred to as the Counter-Reformation. But what you've described there in the second part of what you're describing is exactly what I think's going on. That as we enter the 16th century, and there's lots of reasons for this, there's a tumult of reform. Yep, there's lots of different voices calling for reform. Luther is part of that, just as, say, someone like Erasmus, the great humanist scholar, is part of that. Also, figures who will go on to be quite famous Catholic reformers, actually, certainly in England. So we could take a figure like Thomas More, is calling for reform. Now, of course, held up as one of the great Catholic martyrs, during Henry VIII's time. They're all calling for reform. There's no guarantee which direction it will go in. And that's why instead it's better to think it's Catholic reform, because what we're looking at then, what will become, is a parallel reform movement. It just happens that Luther and others break from Rome. There's no definite thing that's going to happen, but they go that way. There's no definite thing that Erasmus, for all his criticism, in some ways one of the biggest critics, actually stays in union with the papacy. Whilst if you were going to be a betting person at the time, you'd have thought Erasmus looks the likely figure who's going to really do something. So we can see there, we've got a tumult of reform ideas. And the calling of the council, if you like, is on the cards for a long time. There's been other councils in the 16th century already looking at these reform ideas. But if you like, it's the thing that finally spurs some to say, Luther's break with Rome and the growing Protestant reform movement is, if you like, the spur to get those last holdouts, if you like, who are resisting these reform movements, to actually say, okay, we've got to actually talk about this and we've got to work out what's going on. Of course, that doesn't mean it sets which direction it's going to go in, but that's, if you like, the final kicking down of the door. There is a growing clamour of voices that are going on for this. And so you're right, really. It's a process that's come out. It's not just this idea of Protestant reforms are broken away, we're going to shut them down. It doesn't happen like that. There's been this growing movement, and it does play a role. That's not denying it plays a role, but this is about reform. That, if you like, what will become Protestantism and Catholicism afterwards, they're both centred on the idea of reform and what it means to reform religion and to reform the individual in their commitment to it. Internal spiritual reform is the call card of all of them. Just comes out in different ways.
Hey, I hope you guys are enjoying this video, but one thing I know people don't always enjoy is the ads that go with these videos. Now look, ads are how YouTubers like me are able to pay the bills, but if you want to watch these videos early, ad-free, and with my post-show reflections at the end, you can do so by becoming a patron at any tier by going to patreon.com/gospelsimplicity. From $7 a month to $100 a month, your support helps this channel keep going and growing, and not only will you get early ad-free access to these interviews, but you will also get access to the Gospel Simplicity book club, where we read the Church Fathers together, and it is an absolute blast. So if you want those perks and others, go to patreon.com/gospelsimplicity. That's really intriguing to me, and it brings up this question for me of, how the two reform movements relate. So my background's theology, and so the way that the tools I'm given to look at this are often kind of very much you've got this bifurcation, and the difference is theological between the Protestant Reformation and I was always given the Counter Reformation kind of in my terminology. But I wonder from a historical lens if are we looking at this as differences in degree? Like, how do the two reform movements go together? Because the vision we're given here is that they are both reform movements. They have similar impeti. Is that the plural of impetus? In any case, they're working with the same ideas. Like you said, if you were a betting man, you would have probably guessed on Erasmus. And so are we looking at, the same impetus, but the main difference is whether they break? Or I'm just intrigued about maybe the difference of looking at this historically versus purely theologically, if that question makes sense.
Yeah. So it's a really good question to ask, because it can look like that. And in some ways, I'm drawing a crude line, because you have to work it. When we're talking about big movements, we go in a slightly crude line. But when you look at an issue such as grace and its role in salvation, and the action of the individual working with grace or grace active upon, I don't want to get into a whole theological discussion. We go way off there. But those things really live. We know with sort of the Protestant reformers and what they debate, also at those early ones. So, for example, Reginald Pole, an Englishman who is one of the co-chairs of the first session of the Council of Trent, is heavily involved with a group called the Spirituali in Rome at the time during his exile period, and during this, that are looking at ideas of grace. As it happens, their idea of grace will end up being condemned by the council, even though he's one of the first chairs of it. And again, another figure held up as a great, beacon, of early Catholic Reform movement. So we can see these ideas carry on, and they'll carry on afterwards. So if we think of two of the kind of great religious orders, one of them born as part of Catholic Reform, Jesuits and Dominicans will spend about 100 years fighting about, the operation of grace in the whole thing. So you can see these ideas are theological, but they're not necessarily put to bed by anybody straight away, which we can see also on the Protestant side, how you get different interpretations, and so we get the different Protestant denominations beginning to come up. And so on a really crude side, it's those who will continue to be in union with Rome, however much it can become stretched. And it can become stretched, but that is the thing that if you want a really crude sort of defining point, it's the union with Rome that matters.
So we've talked a lot about reform and the Council of Trent as being something, I suppose, of a reform council, which takes a long time. And it also seems like the type of thing that if you were a betting man at the beginning of it, you might not have been able to know exactly how it would go. A lot of councils seem to be that way. And I want to put a pin in this, but we'll get to it, the spirit of the council versus the council itself. But if we start with, there's the spirit of reform, a council is convened and it wants to take up reforms. What kind of reforms are we talking about here? Like, what's at the top of the docket?
They spend a lot of time debating that exact point, Austin, so it's not easy to try and work out what it is. And there's so many interests at play. You think in the German lands at that time, we'll call it Germany for want of a better state, but really, the lands of the Holy Roman Empire and so on. Protestant reform is cutting swathes. It's a movement gaining pace rapidly. They want very different things discussed rather than, say, those who are based in Italy or in Spain. So they've all got different agendas is the wrong word, because that makes us think it's calculation. Of course, there will be some who have calculations, but they've got very different pressing matters on their minds for what they want done and what they want answered. And the problem is that generally they have difficulty in getting together and formulating what it is that they want to do. And especially, again, the French who arrive at the time, Calvinistic with the, reform with the Huguenots, big pressing issue, have very different questions they want asked. I think the big thing is that they ultimately, when they finally get back together for the third session, which is the last one, they realize they've got to come up with reform. And that's when you see a lot of work's done. And they make two big decisions. There are other ones, of course, they firm up transubstantiation, clearly a huge issue, but two that will have lasting impact for what it will mean in terms of what comes afterwards, that spirit, if you like, that you talked about. One is that bishops should be resident in their diocese. It stops the idea of the non-resident bishop completely. Actually, they should have been resident anyway, but it really makes it hard now that they should be. And that they should take on the role of like a shepherd for their flock. So it's visitations to parishes, and meeting on the ground. Doesn't always happen like that, but the idea is they're much more connected to that locality and they're a shepherd for the flock. The second one is the official start of the seminary, the idea of the seminary, the training for priesthood, to raise the standards of the clergy. Now, obviously, on one side, we can see the Protestant reformers have been highly critical of the standards of clergy before. But what's telling is there, we can see Catholic reformers are saying the same. They know there's an issue. Yeah. And so the idea is to create now this new committed, spiritually committed and enthused clergy who are going to be the ones on the ground. So they'll have big, long-lasting impacts, both of them.
This is intriguing to me because it's one of those areas that I think we don't always have a great sense of, like, the life on the ground, like why these issues might matter, especially for a Catholic today, living in a post-Vatican II world. The idea of a bishop being in residence, of a priest needing better seminary training, like these might just seem like such givens. And I also want to recognize, I feel like there's this tension in the narrative that we tell about the medieval period and the late Middle Ages, where, there was a long idea that this was just a dark ages, right? Like nothing good was going on. We rescue literacy and everything's great. And then I think there's been a pushback to say, like, wait, look at the University of Paris. Like, look at all this stuff that's going on, scholasticism. There was great learning here. So let's not, throw out the baby with the bathwater. But I guess, can you help us maybe get in the mind of, like, what was the on the ground reality such that these reforms needed to happen? Because people might think of the Council of Trent as, transubstantiation, justification, these things, but the really, like, ecclesial life seems to be a big part of it. And I think to understand why that matters, we have to get some sense of what were they trying to fix.
Yeah. So first off is the idea of the non-resident bishop. There is the idea of the bishop collecting diocese, which some did effectively for their income before these reforms. But it also means that it can be rudderless. That there's no sort of leadership and saying what happens on the ground, which means you can grow up with very particular situations from, we'll say, village to village, parish to parish, effectively. And that can be different disciplines. So, for example, there's a problem with clerical concubinage, and they know there's an issue with it. Perhaps not as widespread as sometimes some of the rhetoric would say, but there is an issue with it. And they know that's to take a really kind of famous version. But also, what are they preaching, effectively to those congregations? If there's no one seeing what's going on and there's no one training them, you're relying on them to be saying, what's expected to be said. I don't want that to sound too rigid. That's why I was just hesitating there. But I'm trying to get the idea across that you end up with someone that's not being exposed to the latest ideas and coming up with some strange ideas, if you like. What they would view as strange. So it's an idea of beginning to make sure that what's being instilled is the faith of the church. That's not to say that everywhere wasn't doing it, but it's to say there's a tendency and a laxity. And there would be some who would say that's where Protestant reform gains traction. First off, because the ideas can gain root there, but also because they can see someone who is committed to what they are saying, rather than someone who perhaps, certainly the reformers would say, and the hardline Catholic reformers, who's going through the motions. And they don't want, again, this is to take their own rhetoric at face value, but it helps us, if you like, with it. They don't want what they see beforehand as sheep-like conformity. That's not believing. They want someone who is spiritually committed, internal reform. Now, all of that sounds exactly like some of the stuff we would talk about with Protestant reformers, but we can see it there with the Catholic reformers. They're all saying they want spiritual reform. It's what Ignatius of Loyola, founder of the Jesuits, internal spiritual reform and commitment is the watchword. So you can see that's what they're trying to instill. They don't want that sheep-like reform. Someone saying, "Oh well, the law, both secular and religious, says I have to be at the church on Sunday, so I just walk in, and I just watch the elevation of the host, and I've done my business, and I can just go back to doing whatever it is I want to do." Now, again, that's a gross oversimplification, but it is what the Catholic reformers begin holding up as their rhetoric of what they're against. They've had enough of that. This is now internal spiritual reform. And I think, getting back to questions you're asking there and something we've just said, it's really interesting that sounds like what the Protestant reformers are saying as well. And certainly what we would usually think of when we talk about the Protestant reformers.
And if I recall correctly, Protestant reformers, or at least Protestants, were invited to the council as observers. I don't think they came initially, but is there any... my guess is no, but this is just pure... Maybe I'm over-influenced by polemics of the period. Like, were there any Protestants saying like, this is pretty good? Or were they just like still super mad about transubstantiation and everything else going on? Do we have any sense of like the Protestant reaction to this?
Well, they're not turning up, which probably tells you a lot about what they're thinking. But there's also because they feel it's a threat as well. If they're coming from those German lands, and you've got the Holy Roman Emperor sort of sitting around the place as well. There's all sorts of accusations going back and forth between just those who are remaining Catholic anyway. They choose to opt out of it. They don't want in. And it's like when the French don't turn up till the second one, and that's even the French who are Catholic. So there's a lot. We have to see it. Europe is in turmoil at this time, and they've all got a lot of other things going on, and which way to go and which way to trust. But I think for the Protestant reformers, although you could read the Council of Trent as a last-ditch attempt to keep union, to keep the whole idea of Christendom together, and for the Protestant reformers, it's over. They're not thinking that way anyway. It's what we've had what? By the time Trent really got going, you've had 2 or 3 decades. That's pretty decent generational turnover in the early modern period.
And it takes 2 decades almost to complete, right? Like this was a long council. Yeah.
Exactly, it is. It's long, and not everyone's turning up, and it wasn't an idea that everyone would turn up, even Catholic bishops. It's not like we think of now with a church. Say we think of in modern times Vatican II. It was held up from the 60s. This idea of almost every bishop being there, that was never the idea because of just how the times were. Although they might be invited, it was never expected they'd all turn up. So saying that, Trent is one of the biggest early modern gatherings in the world that had ever occurred at that time. But we shouldn't mistake it for what it is now. That it's literally everyone from every corner of the known world being represented at it. It's not like that.
Yeah, I mean, it's predominantly a European affair, right? At least the holding of the council, but it's going to have implications beyond Europe in time. And perhaps we should talk about that a bit. I suppose one thing maybe before that or within that, I want to talk about, there's always a council, right? Like what the bishops, get together and they put in documents that they wrestle over and session after session and all this stuff and working groups. And then there's the implementation. And those sometimes look the same and sometimes they look very different. What was the implementation like? And was it successful in carrying out its aims?
So the one thing I would say, and I probably shouldn't, but I said that councils are fundamentally boring. It's what comes afterwards is the interesting thing. So that's not to say, of course people should work away on it, but it's what comes afterwards. We often see this, the really interesting thing. And those decrees are promulgated at different times in different places. For example, in England, they're never actually promulgated till the 19th century because of the situation of Catholics. But in places like the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, at the time, with a growing number of Protestants, they're promulgated very quickly by Cardinal Stanislaus Hosius. And also in Spain and Spanish territories very quickly. But it doesn't mean that the ideas aren't adopted elsewhere super quickly. So when we're talking about that spirit of it, a lot of the things we now associate with this era of Catholic reform, they're not specified in the council. It's what the council unleashes. And there are things that are issued later on by popes and so on that again affect it, but it's the ideas that it unleashes. So if we give a really general example, and touching on your international side, if we think of the artistic movement, the Baroque or the Baroque movement, we associate with Catholic reform. Caravaggio, for example, this idea of making it real, the art, he takes people off the streets and it's dark and it's kind of quite shocking, that I'm sure, you'll have seen the picture of Thomas, sticking his hand right into Jesus's wounds, very graphic and real. None of that's mentioned in the Council of Trent, but it becomes the artistic movement, the architectural movement, where you can see a certain way of building a church becomes the norm from Rome to South America to elsewhere around the globe, how you see this movement come up. The other thing I would just say as well, because we mentioned the name bit and you mentioned about the European thing, is partly because of that European, it gets called the Counter-Reformation. It's German scholars who at first call it that because obviously they're talking about countering Protestant reformers. That's their main, of course, that's going to be the thing at that time that's in their minds because, well, they're about to enter a 30 years war about it. So it's clearly going to be a pretty big deal. But the reason, it's not just me, but others are calling it Catholic Reformation, Catholic Reform, is because the idea of counter-reform means nothing in South America. Yep, there isn't, it's a new territory, effectively. It doesn't mean anything in parts of Asia that it begins going to. And so to begin to get this idea that it's a reform movement, but its ideas go global, and it's not just about countering Protestant ideas. That's why I was getting back to that idea of the parallel movements. Although they do interplay, and clearly they do, it's broader than that.
It is really intriguing to think that, this time period is so fascinating to me on a lot of levels, right? We've got the Protestant Reformation, we've got the Catholic Reformation going on, but that is a, fairly like Eurocentric view of things. But we also have this age of colonization going on, right? If the Council of Trent's the mid 16th century, 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, as they teach us. This is, happening in force. So what's the impact? Like, is it a Tridentine Catholicism, if that's even I don't know how you feel about that word, that's being exported now around the world? Or is what gets exported kind of a mashup of reform ideas and, colliding with the cultures that it meets? Like, I'm just curious, this is a big period for the Catholic Church. It's going from, primarily European, not to say that there wasn't non-European Catholics at the time, but it's going into new lands. Is it affecting the Catholicism that greets those new lands?
Yes, and it's affecting the Catholicism in those lands, but it's affecting the Catholicism in Europe. It creates a cycle, begins going on, and so this is something that occupies the Catholic Church for a long time in the wake of it, about what it looks like and what Catholicism looks like. And you're right, fine to use the term Tridentine Catholicism is a better one, really, because liturgically we now are in the Tridentine liturgy, that effectively it would be called. But if you're thinking, you mentioned the Americas, and the obvious one with colonization is South America. What happens there is clearly yoked to colonialism. But what we've got to get into our heads is that Iberian interpretation of Catholic Reform, or Tridentine Catholicism, is very specific to the Iberian world. That it looks very different elsewhere. So how it happens there with the mission, it is with the colonizers, and it's quite telling that some of the missionaries, particularly from the religious orders, which is really interesting, which we might want to talk about, are very critical of how it's done. They really don't like, they see what we would call today human rights abuses, that they clearly were, and they criticize them. So someone like Bartolomé de las Casas, who is a Dominican, really takes on what he sees as the Spanish Empire. He really is not happy with what he sees. There's others as well similar to that, even at the early stage. They're a minority, let's be clear, but then they are in the religious order, so they're minority, but they really think it needs to be separated from this colonial endeavour, this exploitation and slavery. There are others who tend to be more hierarchical, so bound to the, they're appointed by the Spanish monarch at this time partly, who are more in with the colonizers and just go along with what's happening. Yeah. So that looks different. And we can talk, if we're talking about the idiosyncrasies of the Spanish world, we only have to think of the Inquisition that other countries refuse to have operating. So let's switch from South America, what we might call the colonialist endeavor, if you like, what it's linked to. And let's look instead at Asia and China, particular, or Japan. Yeah, what goes on there ends up looking very, very different than the Spanish setup. And that's partly you're asking about ideas. Famously in China and India, actually, they begin adopting, particularly Jesuit missionaries, an idea of something called accommodation, which means integrating the local culture with Catholicism and Catholic practice. The Spanish Iberian view is it's Europeanization. But here we have this other idea, some of it pretty controversial even within it. So, for example, it would take Chinese ideas of ancestor worship, they begin to channel into ideas about prayers for the dead and remembrance of the dead and adapting it and so on. That's an extreme version, but you also see inculturation, so what they would wear. So in China, Matteo Ricci dresses in particular ways to fit into Chinese society, so it looks like it. Or when they produce some brilliant images, actually, because again, we have this idea that we're the first globalized world, and we're not at all. And so you can see from the late 16th, early 17th century, books that are prepared telling the story of Jesus that are images. So you'd be used to, in Europe, they'd be cut out, put on the wall, was the whole of devotional ones. In China and Japan, they're changed and put into that environment. So the Virgin is local to China and Japan, or China or Japan, I should say, and in the housing, wearing the clothing to signify what she is. So it's not Nazareth she's in. It looks to them like the world they know, the people they're visiting. Absolutely unbelievable ideas, again, for when we think about these ideas of global initiatives. But it looks really different. Similarly, in England, let's go now right to the doorstep of Catholic Europe. England, just as much as Japan, become some of the poster boys and girls of what Catholic reform looks like because of the persecution there. And the English Catholics promote their martyrs to this European audience. But we have evidence that when some of those clergy, how they're living on England, tell their confreres in Europe. So, for example, there's a great example of a Benedictine. There's also examples from Jesuits. They're horrified in Europe about how they're living and how they're operating in England because they can't compute it. The Benedictines, there are monks who are missioners in England who don't live in community and never do. They might spend a year when they're in Europe in community, and then they're living in a house with not just lay men, but lay women as part of the mission. And they just can't compute this. Same with the Jesuits. English Jesuits, even on the continent, do not wear clerical dress because there's spies looking if they do. So they don't wear clerical dress. When they're on the mission, they again live in these houses. They might well ride a horse, carry a sword to look like your average gentleman going around the place. So even on the doorsteps of Catholic Europe, we have adaptation and enculturation for how it works. Now, I know I've gone on quite a bit there, but what I want to say before I remember is when we talk then about the influences, if we take a really easy example, and we'll take one from Japan in the 17th century and what's known as Japan's Christian century before persecution begins, which you can watch Martin Scorsese's film Silence, and read the book, and you can see what happens, how it plays out. But you even have a samurai regiment that is Christian Catholic becomes, and it's brought to Europe to sort of show them this is what's going on in the mission. Look. Now, you can imagine the shock of that for the people. They go to Milan, they go to Rome, and they're bought. Imagine the shock of those people seeing samurai soldiers walking, marching down the street like a parade. And they begin to see these different ideas of mission going on around the world. So it creates an idea that they are linked up, but it changes this culture sort of, beginning to mingle, if you like, not in the way we know today, but still this exposure. The shock must have been pretty unreal. Same for the missionaries who are arriving in China and Japan. It must have been unreal, for them to get their heads around it and so on.
I love this though, because I mean, it relates to, again, in my world of theology, like competing visions of what Catholicity even is, right? Like, I think there's one sense of it's universal, and by universal, we mean uniform. And so it's this exportation of like, European, Iberian Catholicism that dominates it and makes something, we make St. Augustine, Florida look like Spain, right? Or there's this idea of, integralness and integrity. Anyway, like according to the whole, right? A vision of Catholicism or Catholicity that can incorporate everything. And those things might change along the way, but like, sure, we can take samurai culture and we can baptize that, or we can take various aspects and it can be adaptable. And so many people, I think, associate this with like a post-Vatican II world, but as you said, like we're not the first kind of global society in a way. And so I think this is just absolutely fascinating. And just as a plug for your book, which again, link will be in the description, people should definitely check it out. I love where you start with the story of, I forget his name, he was an English Catholic priest, or at least a Catholic priest in England. And he's, playing card games to kind of go incognito, if you will. He's living in a house, he's hiding. It's just really fascinating. But one of the stories of this that you started to touch on, that I think we'd be remiss not to maybe talk about a little bit more, is the role of the religious orders in this whole story. And it sounds like you've got some unique characteristics of certain ones, the Jesuits in Asia, what they're doing there. But this is a super broad question, admittedly, but what is the role of the religious orders in the Catholic Reformation? And we can break that down and look in different directions. But big question, maybe we can wade into that territory, though.
Yeah, no, so they're vital because you get this revival. Again, actually, you talked about the medieval period. You think when the Franciscans first appear as the great reformers, and the other mendicant, we shouldn't, the Dominicans, but obviously, the mendicant reforms, we see similar happening here, which is quite interesting, actually, when you're talking about looking at different, waves sort of going across time, that we get a huge burst of religious orders and new ones coming to fruition. They all have slightly different views and interpretations. So before we even talk about them, we could talk about another person held up as a great hero of the Catholic Reformation, is the Bishop Charles Borromeo, who has a very particular way of doing Catholic reform. But it looks different than how, say, the Jesuits are talking about doing it. In fact, considering the Jesuits, Charles Borromeo, two great figures of the Catholic Reformation, Borromeo kicks the Jesuits out of his diocese because he doesn't think they're quite right. So that gives you an idea of what we're talking about, these different ideas in different times for what's going on. The Jesuits, again, get a lot of the attention, partly because they're so well organized and they've written their own history very well, so we hear a lot about them. So, they adapt to particular situations, and what they're really into in Europe is education is a vital thing. But also they're different than religious orders have gone before. They don't necessarily they don't pray the office together. They look different. So there were religious orders at the time who think they're not a religious order. They're not, as far as they view them. So again, hugely controversial with what they're doing. But obviously we know they become major pivotal players and figures sort of around the place. But let's just sidestep the Jesuits for a second, because we all know about that. And let's instead look at someone like the Capuchins. Yep. Who we've all heard of, whether it's because of coffee or monkeys or whatever, but we kind of know there's these friars who wander around, Capuchins. The reform movement within the Franciscans. Yep, they're reforming the Franciscans. And in some ways, they and the Friars Minor, the OFMs, are everywhere the Jesuits are. But we just don't hear about them as much, partly because they very much, whereas the Jesuits, part of their mission is often to very educated elites. That's part of what they do. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's just, that's what they do and how society works. Capuchins or Friars Minor will often go to the lower classes. You will sometimes find even almost a dual thing where the Jesuits arrive on mission, go for the higher class within Europe. The Capuchins or the Friars Minor go and are running parish missions for the lower class. We can see them, though, with all different emphases of what's going on and where they're going. And if anything, actually, if anyone listening here, to your or to this channel and so on, wants to do PhDs, have a look at things like the Capuchins, because really we've got a slight problem that we know quite a lot about the Jesuits, and there's loads to do more about the Jesuits, but it means we're getting a slightly skewered view because we're not looking at what, say, the Capuchins were doing, or the Friars Minor, or the Dominicans, or we could go on about people like Vincent de Paul's movement in France with charity and so on. There is work there that's being done. And we could go on with a lot of orders. And of course, same goes for the women. There's huge reforms happening in the female movement. Who's one of the most read authors in Europe at this time is a woman, Teresa of Avila. Yep, held up with her spiritual reform, her mysticism, held up as an example. So it's a great time for variety. Yeah, you think as if you mentioned, let's just say you live in a town in Italy. We won't say Rome because that would be super sort of time, but in any general town, you say you're in Milan, you've got a choice of where you're going as well, for what sort of spirituality suits you and to grow into. So we begin to get this idea of choice. So again, we're far away from this idea of one size fits all. We can see there's different emphases, different choices that are happening and people are making of what appeals to them and their particular devotions and so on.
That is really interesting because, again, it kind of pushes it back against like a hegemonic or monolithic view of what Catholicism is post Council of Trent, that actually this kind of multiplicity of religious orders and kind of various spiritual traditions that they bring with them gives a sense to the laity of there's maybe different ways of inhabiting this thing called Catholicism. I'm really intrigued by that. And you have a chapter, Sensing and Thinking Catholicism. And I'm just curious to maybe press in a little bit more on that sense of, okay, I'm maybe like, I don't know the average life expectancy at this point. It's probably lower than I would like it to be. But, someone who's kind of lived through a decent little chunk of this, like they can remember prior to the Council of Trent and they experience life after it. Again, this is going to vary from place to place. So maybe if you want to pick one, or we can jump around a bit. But what are the things that they're noticing? Because I imagine, again, theological background, I'm thinking like the people who are reading the council documents and all that, like, but the average person isn't doing that, right? Like, so what's the meaningful difference for them in their life?
But we can do a theological one if you want to kick you off as you're a part of that. So one of the great reform figures is Francis de Sales and his devout life, the famous work he does. And really what we could see that as encouraging is what today we would term the idea of the lay vocation, that you don't have to be in a monastery or a convent to achieve holiness. So we can see there what we might call, and it's existed before through different things like confraternities and so on, which we'll get boom again here. We can see the idea of the laity's involvement becoming more and more, whether that's charity and so on. And sometimes, obviously, the reformers will seek to channel that activity in a certain way because they'll think it's gone awry. That's not to deny that. So we can see there's that general lay activism. But the sensory bit is a really key bit, because whereas, again, we're going to do this broad strokes, is probably the easiest to do it. But when we think of the Protestant reformers, we think of the whitewashed walls, yep, and the communion table and the pulpit, everything on the word, yep. The response to the Catholic reformers, and again, it's not dictating the Council of Trent, although it says about the use of images, is good, but instead is to ramp up everything. So if you think of your average Baroque church, well, I was going to say your average one. And if you walk into one in Rome, it is overload. There's things flying off the wall, there's paintings and everything. The idea is to begin to get you to really appreciate you're going to experience at Mass the moment when heaven and earth are joined, that moment of transubstantiation. And so not only have you got this decoration, it ups, if we're talking about a high Mass, all the sensory overload. So you might have the vestments for example, which I use in the book, there's one that has spangles, which are like sequins, really early use, all over the back in the shape of a cross. So you think of the candles through the incense, catching that, they're all limited off. You might have a convent up, you might be in a convent church. So up above you, out of sight, you don't see them, are the nuns singing, literally your choir of angels as you go in. Everything is sensory overload. And that's what they want to show you, that this is a key moment. It's like you're right, it's one of the dividing lines, transubstantiation, and to show that this is the moment, heaven and earth and all the saints are gathered round you at that moment. Now, I don't think everyone experienced that at every mass, and I don't think they managed to get to that. But that's the idea. They want, that this is different. Look at this. You're in a Protestant church. When you're in a Catholic church. There's difference. One of my favourite examples is an item, again, it's in the book, and it's held in the Victoria and Albert Museum now, even though it's made in Germany, is a monstrance. So a monstrance would be something that would hold the consecrated host. So what was believed to have become the literal body of Christ. And this monstrance is the Last Supper, and all the disciples, they're all round it, the 12. There's still 12 of them. Judas hasn't gone in this one. He's still there. But in the middle, where Jesus should be, is just a hole. And in that hole is where the consecrated host goes. So even though they're getting this, they're being told, look, Jesus is there now. You see, there's the gaps there because Jesus is inserted. And I think, in terms of sort of visual, if we're going to be clever, visual catechesis, what a brilliant thing that is. The idea, because you don't have to be theological wonder kid or whatever to work out what's going on. You're being told that is Jesus, and there he is. And so that sensory thing is vital. Of course, there's stuff happens, with all sorts of learning and so on, we could talk. But if you're there on the ground, you can see something is ratcheting up. And of course, the notion you're beginning to get good preaching as well. And you might have Capuchins come around and run a parish mission as well for you all suddenly, and things like that. So everything is beginning to change. I was going to say beginning to alter, but I didn't want to get us confused with altars with an A and altar with an E. But you know what I'm getting at.
Yeah, and this is a fun example of where Protestantism and Catholicism take divergent paths, because, there's some agreement on we need reform, we need better priestly education. The bishops should be in their diocese. We need all of this stuff. I think a lot of that we said early on, like both sides could sign off on that. Erasmus and Luther are both happy with it. But the visual and even kind of the liturgical expression seems to go in very different directions, right? Like we strip the altars, we smash images in the streets, and you get these whitewashed churches, which again, like as you said, there's local variation here, and depending on theological nuance, but largely speaking, there's a movement of smashing statues and making things a lot more streamlined. And then you have like the minimalist's worst nightmare in a Baroque church, right? Like let's just go all in, let's throw it all out there. And I think this is a really intriguing way of seeing one area where theological ideas like transubstantiation begin to express themselves in how we adorn things, right? Is the host, is that the center of what's happening here, or is it the pulpit? Is that the center of what's happening here? I just find that really intriguing and a helpful way for people to maybe latch on to one of the kind of divergences here. I suppose one thing I want to ask is, and maybe this is the wrong way of viewing it, so I'll grant that. This might be a counter-Reformation type of thinking. But I imagine one of the goals at Trent and from the Catholic reformers would be to kind of stop the spread of Protestantism, to firm up Catholic identity in historically Catholic lands, and maybe gain some territory back. And of course, this is done militarily in this time. But I'm curious, was there some success in terms of, do we have any sense that the laity thought this is really nice? Or maybe that's the wrong way of thinking, because so much of this was top down. You get the prince and the laity follow. But yeah, is there any sense that this does give Catholicism a boost in terms of, wait, there's this positive Catholic identity that we want to hold on to?
Yeah. So yeah, you're right. Really, that there is, and but you're right because the issue of confessionalization can mask it because we know that this idea that the ruler sets the religion, but we can tell it has an effect though by things like baptism names. That they advocate using certain names, using the saints' names, so you can see that come in. Now, we can argue all day about whether that's fashion, or keeping up with the next door neighbours or whatever it might be, but it's still there, and we can see people being committed enough to go through it. So again, if we go to the fringes, the peripheries, places like England, in Japan, they're willing to die for this. For what they're coming to. So it is a really hard thing, of course, because we can never say, the whole thing of internal spiritual reform is pretty hard to know what someone's doing internally, history, but we can see it does have an impact. So for all there's the rulers, we can see it. And because of, for example, donations and benefactions, of what's going on, we can see it working out that way, and what they're supporting, and the way they will support parish missions. They will go on pilgrimages. Pilgrimages, is another thing, comes right back up again after the Catholic Reform, whereas Protestant Reform, again in different places, in different ways, becomes much more sniffy about the old pilgrimage sites. So all those things would tell us that it does have an impact, and of course, it's sometimes it's hard because we're in an age where religion is seen as a private thing, but of course then it's so public, and so it's so tied up with who they are, and even the language of the day, the political language of the day is religious, and the religious language of the day is political, like you say. So it's so entwined. So there's a certain movement amongst historians, I would say now, whereas before, we'll call it the bad old days when Marxist historiography was holding sway, where religion was just put on, to get material gain. It was about power. It was about wealth. Thankfully, generally, historiography has now left that behind. I think there's now a historiographical movement we're seeing where we actually take at face value that people believe what they said they believed. And by that I mean as well, we don't then put a modern idea on it, but that was kept away then from the decisions they made, that actually, because they believe that, it affected how they acted and how they responded to things. Sort of now, of course, again, there can be all the caveats about people doing things because others are and so on. But I think that's a really healthy historiographical movement. This is more general now than even the book, to begin to really take it and believe. That's what they said they believe. Who are we to decide they didn't believe it just because, for whatever reason, the modern world says, well, they didn't really believe that. They didn't believe in levitating saints or whatever it might be, which was the Carlos Air book recently, that we should actually, if that's what they believed was happening, we have to accept that. Doesn't matter what we think of it.
Yeah, and I mean, to show my cards, I think I agree. I think that's a much more, a much fairer historiographical method here. Like, we probably shouldn't assume we know what people believe more than they knew what they. And I mean, I think that also just goes to modern discourse as well, to zoom this out as much as possible. Like, I find it's just more helpful. It's like, if this is what you say you believe, like, I'm gonna take that on face value until I'm given good reason to think otherwise. It's a rather precarious place to be in, to think we have better access to someone's internal life than they do. I don't think that bears good fruit usually. One, perhaps last, maybe I'll ask one other to kind of wrap us up, because this might be an odd place to go, but you talked about levitating saints, pilgrimages. One of, it seems to me, the most loaded words in this time is superstition. And it's certainly like a battering ram used by Protestants against Catholicism. But I get the sense that it has, within the Catholic Reformation, there's people who are saying, like, we do have some problems with superstition, but also, like, not throwing the baby out with the holy water, if we will, in this metaphor. So how does that work? Because to me, that's a really interesting aspect of this, is the role of this idea of superstition in, not to zoom it out too much, but in kind of making the modern world in some ways too.
Yeah, well, I guess this relates as well to something you were saying there about shoring up the boundaries. That undoubtedly, what happens at Trent and afterwards is shoring up the boundaries of what it means to be Catholic. So, to be Catholic is belief in transubstantiation. We've already touched upon, but as part of that, it involves belt tightening as well. That there's a recognition there's some wild things going on the fringes. They're looking to. Well, I'm not sure about that. So we give a particular one. We could give the examples of some cults of saints that have grown up. Of course, the saints will be a focal point as well for the Protestant reformers. But what you see then happening is Rome, if you like, bringing in the decisions around saint making, and there's a whole process for it, and it becomes a scientific process. That just because someone said they saw this, when this saint was beheaded, his head bounced 50 times and then a well sprung up there, they're not going to accept that. They want to, if they decide that's what happened, they decide what's happened. But the point is, it's not going to be just these local things that grew up, all the time. And so there's, as I said, we're using it in the early modern sense, but there's the beginning to take a scientific approach to these things. It's not just enough for someone to say that person's really holy. They died and now they're a saint. So again, I mentioned the English martyrs there. The English martyrs, although there are attempts, they're not canonized till the 20th century, even though they die in the 16th, 17th century. Some people are made saints quicker than that, but we can see, and there's all sorts of things going around it. But what I mean is, you can see there the belt tightening in effect, that they want to stop these sorts of things coming in, and other abuses that might creep in as well around different beliefs and so on that come on.
Dr. Kelly, this has been absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much for your time today. A lot of people who listen to this are going to be fascinated, like I have been, by this discussion. Their next step is to go grab this book and read it. But after that, if someone says, I want to learn more about the Catholic Reformation, but man, this seems like a giant thing to wade into, what recommendations would you have for someone? And I left the shout out, by the way, in there for someone looking for a PhD topic of the Capuchins. I think that's really fun, and I'm sure there's people listening who are interested in that type of thing. But maybe between doing the PhD on the Capuchins and having read your book but wanting to go deeper.
So one of the books I would recommend, and I actually do start often with my students with it, is a recent book by Ulrich Lehner called The Inner Life of Catholic Reform. And I think that can be, you said you like a bit of theology, Austin, so we'll give you a bit of that, because it talks about the spirituality and the theology, the internal side again, so the different impulses that are going on. It's a really good way to start on it, but not just books. Books are great. You can go and find books on it, but also you can get ideas through films. Actually, although I mentioned Martin Scorsese's Silence, of course, started as a book, Silence, but you can see there visually, what's going on with that idea of Catholic reform and I was going to say the mission, which leads neatly, of course, to another film that involves Catholic Reformation, which is the film The Mission, about the Jesuits in South America, and what's going on. So there's lots of different ways you can plug into it, because I do get that not everyone, I might like reading these books endlessly, but not everyone does. So you can get into it that way. Or even if you can do it by visiting places. It's easy if you're in Europe, but also there are places in South America and North America where you will see what it looks like. You will see a church that's modeled on one of these Catholic Reformation churches, or whatever it might be. Or art you can look at. We mentioned Caravaggio, but Zurbarion's paintings of St. Francis of Assisi are actually quite eerie and scary if you see them. You clearly get the idea, Francis is a bit of a maverick when you're looking at them, and quite scary to be around. He recaptures that. So there's a lot of different ways you can access it to learn about it through different medium.
I love that. And I think it's good to be reminded that there are more ways of learning than books. So I really appreciate that. Dr. Kelly, once again, thank you so much. This has been absolutely fantastic.
Brilliant. Thank you.